presentation so that we can share this again in the future. We thank you all for joining us this evening. We realize this is kind of a crazy time to be doing this work and in the midst of COVID and so much more. And I want to just start by appreciating my fellow committee members who you can see here today, who have been doing this work with us since the beginning, who are an amazing group of individuals, as well as several more who were not able to join us on screen tonight, who have also contributed to this effort. And I also want to thank Carleton College for co-hosting the event with us tonight, having some students who are part of the whole process and helping us to make this happen. It's 7:01 now. We can go ahead and get started with a welcome and an introduction. Then you will hear from each of us tonight, sharing insights and ideas that we have heard during this, our planning and preparation and the work that we have been doing. So I'm going to take a second here and share my screen with everyone so that you can see our presentation. One second. Technology. How many of us have spent time on Zoom in recent days? So tonight we are here with the Northfield Cannon Falls League of Women Voters. As I mentioned, we have been doing this youth project since June. So we're coming up on many months of doing this work together. I want to just lay out for you what the plan is for tonight, set the context, and then move forward with all of our presentations. So first and foremost, we're going to do an introduction to the project, a brief summary of what we have done since June. We have been doing, we conducted a survey. So we want to share our results from the survey. And then we have also been exploring policies that could help create the healthiest, safest community in Northfield. Next, we want to move to question and answer and try to have a discussion amongst you with us. We look forward to hearing your feedback and your questions. And as we continue to explore this project, where we go next. So a couple of things to set the context. As I mentioned, we are working with the League of Women Voters. I am co-president of the League of Women Voters of Northfield Cannon Falls and also on the state board. When we do our work in League, we are a nonpartisan organization. As you will see, this is an issue-focused presentation, not one that in any way takes any kind of particular political stance. We also base our work in positions. So I wanted to just bring up the League of Women Voters of California has a position on criminal justice. We are exploring how we can also support the creation of a position in Minnesota, in Northfield and in Minnesota. That will happen through study and consensus. The work that we have been doing as a committee can contribute to that. So that's some of the things through League. A couple of the other context setting that I want to do is and my goal here is to frame the larger national context for this work. So we in our work have been recognizing that to work on policing in these times can be a charged conversations. There are some who feel that the police can do no wrong, and there are some who feel that the police should be abolished. And we have sought to work sort of a middle path in that context, recognizing that there are strengths and weaknesses in every organization. And so how can we find ways to do organizational advocacy and help improve the organization that we have at hand and create, again, as I said, the best community for Northfield. So we looked, and there will be more detail about our exact process, but there are many things happening right now in the policing world. So Obama called together a 21st Century Policing Task Force. And so we looked at sort of the components of this report. There were 59 recommendations with 92 action items and an implementation guide. There is too much there for any small committee to tackle on their own. But We also know that there were many good insights there. So the idea in general is, how can we learn from others? So there's a national level conversation. There's also a state level conversation with George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd, and then the subsequent police reform. So some of our ideas may well be incorporated in the police reforms that were implemented this summer, that are required to be in place by the 15th of December, although we're still learning. And I really want to highlight that as a theme for us. We are a committee that is in the process of learning, trying to educate ourselves in every way that we can so that we offer responsible recommendations. In addition to the 21st Century Policing Task Force, Minnesota has passed policing guidelines. And so those are some of the larger contexts. We also want to recognize that in Northfield, there is the coexistence of multiple levels of police. So there is both the Northfield Police, there are small surrounding community police, and the sheriff and the county level. So we also, though, really did want to focus our survey on Northfield Police so that the data that we could gather was all about Northfield. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to, I'm going to just share, our goals. So our goals for this webinar are to share our findings, discuss the policies we have looked at, have an informed discussion, and more broadly, promote awareness of police-related issues and community attitudes, so that we really open up this conversation in a proactive way to raise awareness among those who are here tonight and those who will see this and who we will talk to at a later date. So our future plans are to continue to review the data that we have gathered, to consider policies, in particular, consider mental health, and hopefully to do some additional presentations and or conversations with relevant groups around Northfield. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Julia, who will talk a little bit more specifically about what we have been doing as a committee. Take it away, Julia.
All right, so this project has been led by the League of Women Voters from Northfield and Cannon Falls, as well as young people from Carleton, the League, and Northfield Youth Bank. And so far, we began looking at police data and policies. That was kind of an ongoing thing over the summer and the fall, including in Northfield, Minnesota, the whole country, just what were different police departments doing. We met with a criminal justice expert and the new Northfield police chief, who's here tonight. Thank you. And we've conducted a community-wide non-scientific survey about policing, the results of which we'll be looking at today. We've also been examining alternative models for policing and police policies for our community. And we just want to know, what's the best way to make a welcoming and healthy community for everybody here in Northfield?
I just realized that probably for this to work, my video has to show. We're all learning technology. Okay, there you go. So, Julia, you want to talk? So, we gathered surveys and we have over 200 responses from the survey that we gathered. As Julia acknowledged, it is a non-scientific survey, and yet we really sought to send out the survey through all of our networks. You'll see who responded, but it included folks from the League, from Rotary, as well as from the Key and other local youth groups and youth efforts. So we really tried to send it out through social networks and through organizational networks to get as many responses as we could. We did not expect this high level of response, so we are still in the process of analyzing all of our data and trying to figure out exactly what it tells us. But Margot is going to talk a little bit about the demographics of who actually completed the survey.
All right, so as Adrienne mentioned, this is not a very scientific survey, so we have to look at who actually responded. And as you can see on this slide, it was mostly students, although we did also get a large chunk of people over the age of 50, with people between 50 and 25, making the largest. And it was an optional question, so a large portion of people also just chose not to respond. Yeah. All right, this next slide just goes into a little bit more depth of where these students were. So we can see that most of them were at Carleton, and then a smaller chunk in the Northfield School District, and an even smaller chunk at St. Olaf. We also, as we saw in the previous slide, got a large chunk of people who aren't part of any school district, aren't students. This one goes into gender, and we got an overwhelmingly female response. We also got a fair number of male response, as to be expected, and people chose not to answer, and we got a couple, not that many, members of the LGBTQ plus community. And this last slide is very important for this issue, and seeing as this is Northfield, the overwhelming majority of responses were white. We also got a fair number of different races, and a fair number of people chose not to respond. And I believe, yes. And I will pass this on to Adrian or Julia.
Yeah.
Yes, Julia.
Okay, so here you can see we have a Wordle that has been put together with some of the more outstanding words from people's survey responses of the question, what is your impression of the Northfield Police Department? So I'm just gonna like take, 15, 20 seconds. I want you guys just to like take a look at this, examine what are some common words that you see, what sort of trends are you seeing here, which words do you maybe agree or disagree with, and just kind of gather your thoughts about this, because I think this is really powerful. All right, Adrian, can you move it to the next one, please?
Mhm.
Thank you. Okay, and so as you probably noticed, the last Wordle was about positive responses, and this one is all about the negative responses of people's first impressions, or not even first impressions, just general impressions and ideas about the NPD. So again, I'm going to ask you to take a look at this, just examine what words and trends that you see here. Okay, and I think now I will pass it off to Adrian, I believe.
Mhm. So as you can see from those Wordles, we see both positive and negative responses. And one of the things that the 21st Century Police report talks about is the need to assess attitudes towards the police in a community. And so we felt that that first question that we asked, which is sort of what are your impressions of the police, begins to address that question. So there are clear positives and there's some clear negatives, which tells us that there is work that needs to be done. So in order to think about the work that needs to be done, we began to look also at, well, we started even earlier, we looked at policies. So we started by trying to get a copy of the Northfield Police policies, and we discovered that those are not necessarily easily accessible. And that is another thing that is sort of a recommendation. So at this point, in order to do that, we did 2 FOIA requests so that we could get a copy of the policies. It turns out that it is an $85, 328-page document. As a committee, we broke it into chunks and read all of it. So it may well be that there are things that have been done with the Northfield Police Department, like critical intervention training or other programs that we're going to talk about now that may have been started, but those are not yet reflected in the policies. So we are going off of what we were able to find, recognizing that we need to continue to be in dialogue around all of this. So, so I'm going to turn now to our findings, which actually, so this is sort of, so next we have our specific findings and community opinions, where we ask people about so we asked 2 follow-up questions. What, have you had any experiences? Have you had any positive experiences with the police? Please describe. Have you had any negative experiences with the police? Please describe. And so the following slides will sort of describe the trends that we saw as we looked through the slides. And we decided to categorize them by age, gender, and race as a way to help us with our analysis. So the first one, which is on age, goes right back to Julia.
Yeah, so age was a really interesting one. And as Margot said, age was an optional question and not everybody chose to chose to answer that, excuse me. But we found that in general, people who have lived in Northfield for longer periods of time, particularly over 10 years, had an overall more favorable view of the police. And then people who have lived in Northfield for shorter periods of time, for example, maybe college students or people who've lived here for just a couple years for work and whatnot, had a more negative view of the police. But I did notice one interesting outlier, and that was that people who had lived in Northfield their entire lives, which could be anywhere from 20 to 60 years or more than that, also tended to view the police more negatively. And while obviously generational differences play a role in this, I think younger people just in general tend to view the police more negatively than their older counterparts. Age was very interesting, and it wasn't altogether conclusive, but right here are just a few of the broad statements I was able to gather from the data.
And then we'll hop right on to race. I seem to really like charts, so I did 2 more charts, and that was just looking over the words you saw in the Wordle. Were white people saying more positive things? Were people of color saying more positive things? And what you can see in these graphs is that white people did generally tend to be more positive, but there was a fair amount of people of color who were also very positive. There was also a fair amount of white people who were very negative and people of color who were very negative. What I saw in general in terms of race was negative and positive experiences in those 2 questions that Adrian was just talking about. People of color didn't seem to have lots of run-ins with the police, but they did seem to view them as scary or intimidating or just a little racist. They felt as though in some small situations they weren't treated fairly. Positive experience were almost exclusively from community engagement. So a church program, cops coming into schools, so that really seemed to positively affect the opinion of the police, especially for people of color. I also noticed a little bit of an age trend where people who had lived in Northfield for longer periods of time, generally as part of the community and not students, tended to have a more positive view of the police if they were people of color, and people at colleges tended to have a more negative view of the police, probably because they lacked that community engagement part. And we'll move on to Adrian.
And so then the last way that we looked at this, whoopsie daisy, was through the gender lens. And so again, just to remind everyone, the majority of respondents slightly were identified as female. we saw that the majority of the negative responses came from female responders. They also tended more to talk about their own firsthand experiences. And if they had no experiences, they wrote that down as well. So I'll show how that appears. The male survey respondents showed more positive experiences in general, whether or not they had direct experience with the police. And we feel like this really mirrors some national trends that we saw when we looked at studies of policing experiences in the United States. One interesting thing that I think we may have more of a presence of in Northfield, the non-binary survey responses indicated that individuals who identify as non-binary, which means neither male nor female, but non-binary, that they seem to have had several negative experiences. So I think that in a college town where many people are sort of exploring who they are, there may well be a special population in Northfield that would, it could benefit police training. So that is a very specific subgroup that we found in our responses that may well be more about Northfield. So overall responses based on gender were varied, but they also showed some underlying issues that need to be considered. So in addition to sort of general trends, we also tried to pull out some specific general positives. So, okay, so there we go. So these, and we decided, we did ask for names, but we committed to confidentiality. So in the end, we decided that we would not even directly quote anyone's statements so that we continue to maintain that anonymity for folks who participated. In general, there were lots of positives. 182 responses indicated something. However, one thing that we found is that both in the negative and the positive, people would answer and say, no, I didn't have any positive, or no, I didn't have any negative. So even though Google Forms gave us a nice number here, it's not entirely accurate because not everyone then actually had text within them. But we saw that, much as Margot said, there was appreciation for police participation in community events. One that made me smile was the ice cream coupons for helmet wearing that how many young people in Northfield have gotten over time. Although there is a risk for negative, as one of the negatives was, I was wearing my helmet and the police officer did not give me a coupon. So we can think about how who gets coupons or not coupons is something, but I just want to point to that as generally a positive. There was appreciation for police stops that were professional, courteous, respectful. And there seemed to be quite a few positive responses for help when people were called for break-ins. So those are some general trends in the positive that we saw. In the negatives, again, just like I said before, there are 176, but many of these were not actual responses. So those are not numbers to take to heart. Several of them pointed to other levels of the police, like the sheriff, as being problematic. Now, I'm not sure that everyone is aware of the different levels of police, so it was striking to see some point to other levels. There were a number of complaints about people of color being pulled over and not treated well, either by the respondent or a family member or a friend. So like someone who said, my spouse was pulled over and he was a man of color and they pulled him over in our driveway and then sort of approached him with hostility. It was our driveway, right? So we can think about ways in which both the people of color experience that and also the larger community narrative that provide some opportunity for working on. Another one that stuck out to me was there was a community situation where someone overheard a police officer as they were talking about immigrants saying, well, I wish they would all go home to where they're from. So that kind of thing can have a much larger repercussion long-term. And then there have been, interestingly enough, in the year of COVID, a few complaints about police officers not wearing masks. So certainly the police comments range. One of the other things, an example from some of the college campuses where only the person of color was asked to prove that their drink was non-alcoholic while the others were not. And some comments that sort of point to issues around poverty and class and ways that this may appear in Northfield as well. So someone who said, when I had an older car, I kept being stopped. Now that I have a newer car, I'm not as much anymore. So how are people being grouped into categories, either because of what they look like or what their car looks like? Stopped headlights seem to be another favorite of problematic stops at times. In general, though, as we looked at this, we did not see many extreme examples of violence. In fact, I don't think that we saw any examples of violence from Northfield Police. So that speaks positively to certain aspects of the Northfield Police. And we really want to hold that up and celebrate that, because that is a huge component to making a safe community. At the same time, people do need to be heard and listened to as women who talked about in the domestic violence that they may not have felt respected, or people of color. So again, going back to that idea, generally there were probably more positives than negatives, but there is work to be done regarding people of color, some youth, some non-binary experiences, and valuing female experiences and requests for help and honoring them. One woman described, for example, how when the police came to the door, she had called and the police officer said, well, where is your husband? Maybe we can talk to him instead. And so how do police interact respectfully with whoever they need to deal with? But again, as I said, there were many, many positives. So with that, I want to turn it over to policies that we have been looking at that we think could help. And the particular reason to say this is that we are very excited that Northfield has a community police task force that is currently reviewing policies. And so we really are hopeful that these recommendations and that this information will go to that committee and help them as they do their work in the next weeks. It's part of why we did this meeting so quickly, was so that we could provide this information to them as they review the Northfield Police components of the Northfield Police policies. So policies make sense. They're innovative and hopefully public safety models and recommendations. So I'm going to turn it over to Charlotte and Emily to talk about police crisis intervention teams.
Hi, everybody. I'm Charlotte, and I'm just going to give a little overview about crisis intervention teams, which I believe Northfield has recently started to implement. And so basically, police crisis intervention teams revolve around a course that everybody in the police department would take, and it gives an in-depth look at mental illness and its implications for first responders. These types of programs have been implemented all across the United States. Those are some examples there as well. And really what is so impressive and important about these programs is it's not just about the police. It's not just about mental health. It's about how do we all come together as a community, as individuals, as the police, to work together and create a safer and healthier community for everybody. So it focuses on de-escalation techniques, active listening, in order to prevent violence, and yeah, just creating a way that violence doesn't have to be a part of this.
So an example that has been successful for 30 plus years is Cahoots. And Cahoots stands for Community Assistance Helping Out on the Streets. And this is a community-based public safety program based in Eugene, Oregon. And they focus on responding to crises involving mental illness, homelessness, and addiction. They get over 22,000 calls annually, and they partnered with the Eugene Police Department back in 1989. The Cahoots team consists of one medic, so a nurse, paramedic, or an EMT, and one crisis worker who has training and experience in the mental health field. These people are not trained in law enforcement, though, and therefore do not have the same authority as the police do. However, this program has been very effective, as only 150 times out of 24,000 times were the police called for backup.
And so we as Charlotte mentioned, um, we we understand that there may be some training that has happened in Northfield, but this is really something that we think could help, especially given that we did get several comments around mental health and are aware of the prevalence of mental health crises and what happens next. So another one is the sanctity of life principle. Margot, I think this one is you.
Mm-hmm. All right, so sanctity of life is a central principle used nationwide that commits to using the least force necessary to achieve lawful objectives. We think this is particularly important due to all of the talk of violence and the police and everything that has been happening this past year. It is enforced through police training and emphasizes minimal force, duties to intervene, providing first aid, crisis intervention, and de-escalation, gaining more traction as it has been an effective way of promoting morality in many police procedures across the country.
And this is a policy that has, as Margot recognizes too, really been gaining this whole question of like, how do you create the safest, how do you within the police? And we really sought to have some recommendations that would cost no money. And so this is one of those that can be implemented without cost if you put in just simply policies around sanctity of life into the police procedures. There are ways though to take this farther. So, Julia.
All right, so this policy is called EPIC, and it stands for Ethical Policing is Courageous. And EPIC is a peer intervention program for police officers that was developed fairly recently by the New Orleans Police Department and community partners. Its goal is to promote a culture of high quality and ethical policing through educating and empowering officers in the streets to help play a meaningful role in policing one another and intervening when their fellow officers do something unethical. It is based in the social science principles of active bystandership as described by psychologist Dr. Irvin Staub. It has been proven to result in happier and healthier officers, better morale and recruitment in police departments, better relationships between police and the public, including better trust in officers, and overall has resulted in fewer complaints, disciplinary issues, lawsuits, and grievances in the police department and the public. This program's essential goal is to bring about a cultural change within police departments to ensure safe policing and prevent misconduct. And to quote directly from the EPIC website, it's the steps to implementing this is redefining critical loyalty in the departments, changing or adding to what departments look for officers they hire, training officers and supervisors to identify danger signs in certain situations, equipping officers with the skills they need to intervene before problems occur or escalate and to do so safely, therefore like lessening the need to use brutality, supporting and protecting the officers who do the right thing, so not punishing an officer who intervenes with their boss, and providing officers with resources to help them make ethical decisions overall. And this is another program that could be implemented without cost. It just would require a few new policies that would be put in place in the police department. It has been very successful in New Orleans and has been implemented in a few other places, including Baltimore. And if you just Google search EPIC New Orleans Police Department, there's a bunch of resources on the website that departments can pull from and look over to research this for their own use. So yes, I will pass it off to the next one.
So as we did this work, we also really wanted to recognize that Northfield is not Baltimore or New Orleans or LA where they have the sanctity of life. And yet, interestingly enough, when we met with our criminal justice folks, they talked about how often cities are developing cutting edge programs that then smaller communities could consider. But then we also were very fortunate in that we found some reports specifically thinking about the Northfield kind of community. So Amelia, take it away and tell us about this one.
Okay, so the Building Trust with Immigrant Communities was a report put out by the Law Immigration Task Force and the Police Executive Research Forum. It contains 7 distinct ways to build relationships. The methods include a community partner model, hosting community events, using social media, translation services, outreach, distinguishing between local and federal agencies, and leveraging available resources. In the report, there are examples of how all of these methods have helped police departments all over the U.S. build relationships with local immigrant communities.
And given sort of the ever increasing diversity within Northfield, which still frequently does connect to immigrant communities, we felt that this and really working with this report and all the components that Amelia just described is one way to think about, to have information that is relevant to Northfield specifically. Yeah. And Helene, you want to talk about some other recommendations?
Sure. My name's Helene Hopla. I'm on the board of the League of Women Voters, Northfield Cannon Falls. And I just want to say it has been such a treat to work with these young people. I think all of us Northfielders should just be really proud and feel like the future is in good hands. But what I want to talk a little bit about, you know, what started off this whole project was that some of the young people in this group had some questions about, hey, we're seeing all this stuff in the news about what's happening in the big cities, but so what's happening in Northfield? And what we found that as the public, you know, the community is wanting more information, there's about police practices, about what's going on, about whether or not there's, you know, any kind of bias going on, you know, whether or not people feel good about the police or have some questions or whatever, that there is just not a lot of information out there. And for bigger cities, what you're looking at is there's both in Minneapolis and in St. Paul, there's a dashboard that provides data that's available to the public. You just go to the website and there's information that's available to the public. So this just lists some of the stuff that's available on for Minneapolis, on the Minneapolis dashboard, you know, crime location map, stops dashboard, use of force dashboard, stuff like that. And some of the same kind of stuff for St. Paul, including race of the driver, was driver searched, you know, dates, gender, thing like that. But for smaller municipalities like Northfield, there's nothing out there. There's just no information. I mean, we searched and talked with, asked the experts that we talked with, and just didn't come up with anything. And we're basically told by a number of those experts that, you know, people weren't asking for this kind of information before, so nobody's really been keeping it. And so part of the change that we'd like to see is that there would be more information available to all of us, you know, about what is going on in our communities. So those of us in Northfield, that there would be more information available, what's going on in Northfield. And we know that some other municipalities are really looking at doing that. For example, Edina currently says that the record-keeping programs that they use don't allow for them to keep track of a lot of this stuff, but when they update their software in the next year or two, they're going to make sure this stuff is available on there. So we would just like to see Northfield do some more tracking and keep some of this information so that it is available out there for folks. And you know, and that may, you know, we don't really have any, and that would be something that would have a cost attached to it, obviously, because if this kind, you know, it costs both in terms of the time for the officers to keep track of this and updates or you know, replacement of software that is currently used or whatever. But we'd like to see this be a consideration when looking at changes in the future.
Terrific. Thank you, Helene. So we have come to the end of our formal presentation, and we really wanted to share a bunch of information, our survey, the policies, and then open it up to feedback, thoughts, questions from you, and then we're gonna handle them as a group. So I'm gonna stop sharing at this point. My hope as well, and I will repeat this at the end, is that if you are interested in being involved in an ongoing way, we're going to ask also for you to put into the Q&A your information so that we can follow up and invite you to join us in our meetings. But I want to just start. Thank you all for showing your faces. I'm going to stop sharing now and invite you to put things into the chat and the Q&A. So the first question is, how many total responses did you get? And that's a good one. Thank you for already having a question there for us. I invite others also to add more questions. When, Margot, you were the demography data, do you want to answer that one?
Sure. So as of right now, we have 212 responses, but those, we've left the survey open, and we started analyzing it before we've gotten all of those responses. So we've analyzed like 205 of them and looked over a couple of those ones that have been trickling in. But as Adrian mentioned before, this is a sort of a non-scientific study. So we have 212 now. We might not have read every single one of those.
Yep. Great. And we also welcome you just to share thoughts, reactions, impressions. I know Julia asked each of us to look at the Wordle and think about what that said to us. Please feel free to just sort of tell us what your thoughts and reactions were to this. There are no open questions. I cannot believe that with 29 participants, none of you have any thoughts. So I'm going to go into my teaching mode and say, take a minute, and I would love to see 14 or 15 questions. Terrific. There is another one. So I'm going to read this one. The chat is disabled. We're asking you instead to use the Q&A format so that it can come in that way. So at the bottom of your screen on Zoom, you'll see Q&A. And if you click on that, you can ask us a question. So one person says that she is grateful to hear this presentation, appreciating that we stated that this was an informal collection of information that is both helpful and frustrating since we don't have a good sample of folks' perspectives. Still, I'm grateful you collected responses. So thank you for the positive feedback. You know, as a small committee without that many resources, one can't actually do the kind of full survey, but certainly we hope that this can contribute to an ongoing data gathering process since we found almost nothing. And then there is a question. With a couple of apartment complexes coming up, our little town won't be little for long. What is the plan to grow the department? So this is more focused on the police, and we don't know that kind of answer at this point. That's one that I would encourage you addressing to the new police chief, Chief Elliott, who we did meet with him as well. And we do want to recognize that Chief Monty had set up a really positive community spirit that we are hoping will continue in this time. Next, you mentioned that the police department had started CIT training. What has been the level of completion? Are they training their entire force or a select group? I wish we knew the answers to that. We really tried to get information and struggled to get answers, even just basic demographic data. We spent several months this summer I don't know, Julie, if you want to talk, or any of you who went out, Amelia, Margot, we all went out looking. If you want to share what we were able to find or not find.
Honestly, sorry, go ahead, Helene.
I was going to just say that one thing that we did find is that there are now, I believe, 2 female officers on the Northfield Police Department, and I think there are 1 or 2 Latinx folks, and one of those actually, I think, maybe one of the female officers. But so there is, you know, a little bit more diversity than there used to be.
Which is definitely a big positive. But as Helene hinted at, we really couldn't see more than some budget stuff, members of the police department, and perhaps like a large list of the types of stops or calls that people have gotten, with just basic, inside police sort of information. And besides that, we weren't able to find lots of things just through Google and online.
And we did try to go to all the different, so we looked not just initially at Northfield, but also at Cannon Falls, at Dundas, trying to see what was happening at the county level, what was happening with the various police forces, and did encounter this challenge sort of across all of the local police districts or levels. I'm going to read the next.
Adrian, I'm happy to answer the next couple if that's good with everybody.
Great. So one comment is, the word that stood out to me in the Wordle was white. Do you have any thoughts around diversity within the police department? Go, Julia.
Okay, so I agree. This one really stood out to me as well. And I think that on a surface level, more diversity is good. But as we all know, there are deeper systemic problems within the police department. And until those are addressed, simply adding more officers of color or more female officers aren't going to fix everything. But as Helene mentioned, our department is overwhelmingly white, and I think that could lead to a greater level of distrust among immigrants and people of color. So I don't have all the answers here, but if anybody else on the panel would like to share their answers, I'd love that. But basically, my opinion is that more diversity is always a good thing, but I think that there are deeper problems that need to be addressed first. But that's not to say that we shouldn't consider adding more officers of color and female officers and whatnot.
And just to tack on to that, another thing that I noticed, as Helene mentioned, there are a couple female officers and there are a couple Latinx officers, but people don't seem to notice them. I feel from my vague personal experience that the people who generally stand up, go to schools, are more higher ranking white officers, white male officers. So if it is at all possible, just making sure the face of the department, I know this sounds kind of like weird and a little manipulative, but making sure people understand that there are people who look like them in the police department. And that can also just encourage that diversity that we want to encourage.
Other thoughts, panel? All right. Thank you for sending in all these questions. It's really great. Did you, so another question is, did you have any responses about people of color who are students at the colleges having issues with being tracked in town?
I can start off with this one because I was looking at the question of, or kind of like my area of focus was the question about, have you had positive or negative experiences with the police? And I'm obviously not going to quote anybody directly. I probably couldn't just off the top of my head, but yes, there were several instances of that. There was a couple where either it was a group of college students with one person of color, either just walking around town, walking around campus, or driving. They were stopped, pulled over, whatever it may be. And like Adrian mentioned in the presentation, only the person of color was asked to verify their drink was non-alcoholic, or they were the only one asked to show their like license or whatever. And another one I saw was a person of color said that they were walking around downtown. They were just, going about their day, and they were stopped. And the officers asked them to like verify that they were a Carleton student, asked a bunch of like weirdly specific questions that they probably wouldn't need to know just if they were going to stop them briefly. And to the best of my memory, the student wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary. They were just walking around. So those were a couple of examples that really stood out to me. I think those were kind of, I don't know, those were interesting. They made me worry a little bit. If anybody else, any other panelists have specific examples, please share them.
I don't have very many specific examples, but I read the negative and positive responses of all people of color, and there were a lot of times that they felt they were pulled over and just asked more questions than necessary, or things like that just made them uncomfortable, and they felt like they weren't being treated the same as if they were white.
Thank you. Our next question, have you shared this information with the police department yet? If so, what has been their response? So we have not yet. You are our very first. We started to close down the survey on Monday, and we didn't. We're still accepting answers so that we can continue to hear what other people have to say. We invited all of the members of the committee in town that has been formed so that they could be here. We would welcome the opportunity to present it to the police and to have a dialogue with them and understand better what has happened. When we did meet with Chief Elliott this summer, and he agreed that he would be happy to meet with us again. So we do want to sort of follow up on that and meet with him, but I think it would be great to have the conversation. I also, though, do want to recognize that for some people, it may or may not be safe space necessarily even to interact with the police. So how we balance people feeling safe and secure is an ongoing question for us as we do this work. But we would welcome the chance to talk to the police. I do believe, is that correct, team? Okay, yes, because we do it all together, this group. All right. The next comment, I am so impressed with the level of information and thought put into this, especially in such a short time frame. Thank you. Thank you for appreciating it. I can tell you that I want to echo Helene that my experience has been an amazing group to work with, and that we just keep learning from each other and enjoying that. I don't know if others have anything that they want to say about that.
I mean, I think I would like to thank Adrian and Helene for making this happen, bringing us all together.
Me too.
Yeah, I think you also deserve some thanks.
I'm seeing some folks who are indicating that they would like to be part of our effort, and we welcome that. So thank you. And I'm going to just sort of follow that up as a reminder to anyone who would like to be part of this in an ongoing way to please put your name in the Q&A and your email, and we will be back in touch with you. So that is great to see. So the next question is, do you feel like you got sufficient response from our immigrant community, or do you have any plans to make an effort to get more information from that community?
I can take that one. We tried as much as we possibly could to distribute this to all of the networks that we could come up with, whether they were, youth groups or the Rotary or the religious church youth groups or kids at the Key or various the Northfield City Council, various, community groups. I mean, we tried as much as we could to get this out to everybody that we could come up with, including, immigrant communities. Just did the best job we could with that. Obviously, we don't have any control over, we can just kind of send it out, but we don't really have any control over who responds and who doesn't respond. But that's part of why we're still keeping the even though the official deadline has passed, we're keeping the survey open so that if there are other community members or groups that want to respond, that it's still open. Tell them about it and have them respond, because we're trying to make this as inclusive as we possibly can.
Mhm.
And demographic wise, we can see that we didn't quite touch everyone in every community, and immigrant communities especially. And that is why, as Helene mentioned, we want to keep this open. We want to keep this narrative, this conversation going on.
Mhm. And we had a whole conversation about translating the survey or not. And again, we sort of had a moment of, we're just trying to pull this all together, was as much as we could manage. I think we would be very open to doing that translation if it would make sense and could bring in some more answers to if we did it into Spanish. That wouldn't do all the language groups in Northfield, but there is a significant Latino community. And so we did do some targeted efforts, though, to try to reach out into those networks. So the next question, is it true that some local ordinances, noise, disturbing the peace, are enforced when complaints are received rather than proactively and uniformly? How might this practice affect the very experiences of different community populations? So the thing that struck me as I read the responses was that there were several different experiences from college students of police coming into parties and busting them, or to a couple of other parties. So it is clear that the police are active in the party scenes on the campuses, and that there is sort of a nuanced understanding of it's not great, but sometimes even those that sort of said it wasn't great, I realized that there's more ambivalence around that than one might expect necessarily. I think that actually that question really raises something for us to look at some more. So I don't know if my other folks agree, but I think that's a great question to ask us, to give us some next ideas to think about.
Yeah, there wasn't a ton about those types of like local ordinances and police calls in the survey. I don't recall seeing many, if at all. So I think that's a really interesting point. I hadn't really considered that before. So I just want to say thank you for bringing that up. And I'm sure we will definitely look into that.
And I know, Adrian, we've been kind of going in the order that have come in, but I saw another one that kind of also just brought something up that we haven't really dug into. It is the one, has there been any look into the almost $1 million budget increase in the budget since 2013? Are there ways that we as a community can look to divert these funds towards mental health resources and education and community-centered public safety? And as you've seen from our research, we would love to find that out, but we haven't done a very detailed look. Is there anything else you guys want to add about that particular question?
Yes, I have something to add. So I think we talked about this like briefly as a group, and I think Adrian and I did have one conversation about it, but we've been thinking about creating some sort of alternative mental health like helpline or task force group that would come and assist with mental health crises. And in my mind, I see that as being something completely separate from the police. I don't necessarily know what my panelists think, but that's what I envision it as being. I mean, obviously, it's not just me, so I don't really know what that would entail. But we talked about perhaps focusing on that after we're done with this project. Not like done, I guess. It'd be kind of hard to be completely done with this, but once we're ready to move on, we would probably focus on something like that, maybe like in the springtime. And we talked about working with Todd Lippert on that too. He's really interested in creating alternative mental health helplines. But we haven't really gotten much into the economic side of it. But I know personally, I'm really interested in the budget and funds of the police and how much money they're receiving, and how much could be diverted. So yes, we are definitely going to look into that in the future. And I'm sorry we don't have more to say about it right now, because I think it's a very important point. But we know about it and we definitely care about it.
And I think that's part of where we found the cahoots model that Emily talked about as being a model to do this kind of work. So, and we're aware that maybe some other places, maybe even Minnetonka, have adopted a version of it. And so yes. There are more questions necessarily than we're going to be able to cover, but I want to just try to answer a couple of them. So we have a question about how big was your budget for this effort? Is there room to work with translation services? Our budget for this so far, we have spent $85 on obtaining the police policies. Otherwise, it is the volunteer labor of everyone you are seeing on the screen and a few more folks. So we have done this with no funding. And thanks to Carlton for co-hosting the webinar, just again. So I think we would love to have some funds to explore how to do this and, be able to access some more things, or even more actually really redirect the funds far more towards doing some of these model programs and implementing the vision. But it's our time and our energy that has made this happen.
And I think
the $85, the $85 was, I think, there's a general city policy that if you ask for copies of something, you pay 25 cents a page. So when we did the Freedom of Information Act request for the current policies, it ended up being enough pages that the total came to $85. So it wasn't that there was any kind of a flat fee for the report. It was just 25 cents a page and whatever that amounts up to.
And I think I also just wanted to tack on that we haven't been working with a very large budget for this, but we have been working with a lot of volunteer effort, and we would love to have more volunteers. If you know people who are interested in translating, or if you yourself are interested, we would love to get in touch with you.
And the other thing, just to note, my understanding is that after this latest round, the police policies will be posted on the city's website. And so we are excited to hear of that change coming. And okay, I'm just going to try to quickly, we have about 4 more questions and then we will end our meeting. So, do police forces have quality control departments to help analyze their internal records and make improvement recommendations? Healthy conversations keep communities positive. I think that there are citizen review boards, and there is the post at the state level, there is the police officer overview. And so the Post Board has just released an audit, but we found that many of their recommendations were more valid at the state level than Northfield level. So that's what we are aware of. But as to quality control, anyone else out there know anything more?
I mean, there was a lot in this audit that Adrian mentioned, a lot of quality control sort of things that the Post Board found, but many of those things they mentioned did have to do with more organization and more information at a state level and more quality control that way and less at a community level. But they were all very good recommendations.
Mm-hmm. And our understanding is that this committee, for the first time, that has been created by Chief Elliott and Mayor Pownell and the city administrator to look over the policies, is sort of a newer attempt to bring in some multiple perspectives. And we want to celebrate that and encourage inclusion of youth voices in that process moving forward. So next question, Police Chief Elliott addressed the Chamber of Commerce recently and said that nearly all the officers have been through the 40-hour training to deal with mental health issues. He also said that they have an online translation service available to all the officers, as well as 2 officers that speak Spanish. So clearly the police department is trying to do things, and we encourage that and applaud that, and also want to think about what else can we do to move beyond 40 hours of training to developing actual programs to handle different kinds of situations. So 2 more. On that same note of immigrant communities, have we considered looking at ICE as well as the Northfield Police Department and their potential collaborations, especially in its capacity as a controversial law enforcement agency that targets undocumented individuals and has become known for doing so in Northfield?
I know that we don't really have a ton of answers, but I'm happy to talk about this a bit. This is just something that I've been thinking about just on my own time, and I'm sure I'm not the only one. But I noticed that several survey responses said things along the lines of that the police department are ICE enablers. They need to stop working with ICE. And well, I don't know a ton about the connection just personally. I definitely agree with that. And just things that I've learned through my experience living in Northfield is that immigrants can be afraid to call the police because they think that they might run into issues with ICE. And if people of color already have to be worried about calling the police, that extra level of fear just is just much. It's a bit too much. And we obviously don't want immigrant communities to feel like they can't call the police if something bad is happening. And same with the pandemic and everything that's been going on with rent and things like that. It's been a prevalent problem, especially recently. And I'd be definitely very interested in looking at ICE along with the department. But I also have noticed that we didn't get a ton of immigrant responses, which is completely understandable. They probably feel unsafe sharing their information, which I get. So I definitely would like to look into this, and I'm sure my fellow panelists would as well. And I'm just sorry we don't have more answers on this right now. Yeah.
I will say that it was, oh, and Amelia, you've got more, you go.
Oh, I was just gonna add on to Julia. I agree with everything Julia has said. I was just gonna add, with the policy that I talked about, the building trust with immigrant communities, there's a section about distinguishing between local and federal agencies, which is something that should be considered, I think.
Mm-hmm. And as a resident of Northfield, I do know that Chief Nelson Monty, the former chief, really made a concerted effort to communicate to the immigrant community that he was there for them and that he did not see his role as being to connect with ICE. So I feel like he really started a tradition, and I'm hopeful that as the police department continues to develop, that it maintains that commitment that he had to seeing the Northfield Police Department as a local police department. Yeah. One last question. Have you run into any conditions or situations unique to Northfield that might suggest other changes that might be needed to address concerns specific to this community?
I think the big ones we mentioned, Adrian, have to do with the fact that we are a fairly large college town. So things like parties, people staying and living here for only 4 years, a larger portion of people who are just trying to figure out how they want to express themselves, things like that. Play a role into how the police should work with the community.
That also heavily ties in with the immigrant question, because I know at one point recently we were doing a search into rural policing and kind of what that entailed for communities like ours. And one thing that was brought up was that, yeah, we have a lot of immigrants in our town. how do they feel about the police? How does the police feel about them? What are the intersections with ICE? And so obviously that's not only specific to Northfield. A lot of places, a ton of places have a large immigrant community, but that's something that's pretty important for our town because we're not a big city. So the fact that we have a diverse immigrant community is really interesting and definitely needs to be addressed when we're talking about policing and police models.
So as you can see, we have future projects and steps to do. I want to thank all of you for joining us, for all of the questions that you raised. We hope that you will join us as we continue to do this work. If you know people who would like to hear the kinds of things that we're thinking about and learning about, please let us know. We are happy to continue the conversation. We do see that several of you indicated that you were interested. You can feel free to use the contact us at League of Women Voters if you want to follow up and indicate any questions, thoughts, concerns. Again, I want to thank Carleton and the Carleton students, Charlotte and Emily, as well as the high school students who are here and who are supporting us. We are so lucky to have this kind of energy and dedication in our town. And thank you for all that you are doing. And we will be back in touch with all of you with more as this all evolves. Thanks for joining us and have a good evening.